get clumped all at the end when you're kind of getting sick of the project and ready for it to be done.
But actually, we should be thinking about finishing before we even start. We should think about finishing when we design a project and as we build it.
Yeah, because the inspiration for our project, whether it's a photo or a picture in our mind, already has a finish on it.
But the finish can drive a lot of aspects of our woodworking. Now take this box, for instance, which has been ebonized. This has been made with white oak, which has a very prominent grain to it and works great with ebonizing. So the finish drove the material choice.
And even when we're thinking about the specific finishing steps, I think the more often that we can bring those steps that we normally group at the end into the building process, we're going to end up with better looking projects.
Absolutely. So let's think about a large carcass piece where the interior needs to be finished. It's best if we stain, varnish, and finish that completely as we assemble, because otherwise it's an awfully hard cavity to get into and do a good quality job, and you're going to end up with stain and varnish up to your shoulders.
Well, so today we're going to look at the 4 main steps of finishing. We're going to look at surface preparation, coloring the wood if you want to, and applying the finish. But I think that's usually where people think it ends, but it doesn't.
No, there's actually another 4th step, and that is to apply wax. And that can add a nice, even sheen to your piece. It's a good tactile feel, and it adds another layer of protection.
If you'd like a set of articles to help you master these finishing techniques, they're at our website, woodsmithshop.com. Well, Chris, I think it's time we get started.
I think so. In this episode of the Woodsmith Shop, you're going to learn about ebonizing, wax, and shellac. All fun things. But for me, you're going to learn about vegetables, fiber, and responsibility. In other words, surface preparation. In other words, sanding. But we've got to do it. But for a lot of applications, I prefer the water base. It is easily pushed into cracks, sands very easily, dries quickly. So this is sort of my preference. So that's our first step, is to very carefully inspect our work and take care of any of those little cracks and nail holes and such. Once we're done with that, it's time to move on to sanding. So why sand? Well, it's not just about a smooth finish. When we go through the 3 steps of sanding, in this case I like to use 120, 180, and 220. Not only are we getting a smooth finish, but by getting a consistent surface to our work, we're going to bring the grain out and we're going to have clarity in our finish. So clarity is one of the big reasons that we go through all 3 grits and we work very carefully with our sand. It's so hard and unforgiving. The cork gives just a little bit and works its way into any little slight surface imperfections, and that gives us a more consistent sanded finish. So with this cork sanding block, I'm going to work into areas that I couldn't get with the power sanders, like the edges along these stiles and rails. I want to work into the corners up where our panels meet this style where I couldn't get with a power sander. I can work a little bit on areas where different parts meet, but always being very careful not to create cross-grain scratches. So I really want to watch the direction of my grain and watch the travel of my sanding block. Rounded over edges. A lot of times we want to soften edges, but we want to keep them crisp, we want to keep them consistent. And if I were to just use hand sandpaper alone, well, I might oversand some areas and undersand others. Using a block, it's very easy for me to be consistent along the whole length of my workpiece and always keep things, as I said, very crisp. Now here are 3. These are different grits. So as with the sandpaper, we want to use sanding sponges that have the 3 different grits, a coarse, a medium, and then a very fine. But these are wonderful because they squish a little bit and they'll conform to all sorts of different shapes. And there's still a hard enough edge that I can get in some more complex profiles at work. So it's always nice to bring in an extra light source. And we want to keep that light source relatively low so it really picks out any scratches, any imperfections. It really does a good job of picking up the last traces of surface dust which would otherwise contaminate your finish. So there we go. At this point,
what we're doing with this tannic acid is we're going to brush on a liberal amount. We really want to saturate that top fiber of the wood. This tannic acid is really going to help increase the natural tannic content of the wood, and it's going to even out any discrepancies that you're going to have. So what I found is every board is going to ebonize slightly differently. So this really helps us give us a nice even color. And what's going to happen is, as this tannic acid dries, the fibers of the wood are going to swell up. So we're going to have to sand this down, remove any of those little hairs that have lifted up. But just in case it doesn't, you're going to want to send this through a coffee filter, and that's just going to remove any sediment that could be sitting inside the solution. So now we're going to take this clean iron acetate solution, and we're going to do the same thing we did with the tannic acid, and we're just going to brush it on. And you'll see right away, it really starts to darken up, and it reacts with that tannic acid. And don't worry at this point too much about any streaks or your coverage area. We're just looking for a good, even, heavy coverage. And once it fully oxidizes and fully reacts, it will be nice and dark. So just concentrate on a good, even coverage.
The only issue with it is that I don't think it's real easy to use straight from the can. And the reason is that when you see it here, it has a thick, syrupy consistency. And when you apply it to wood, it's pretty sticky and gummy and ends up drying, leaving streaks. Very disappointing. Instead, what you need to do is thin the shellac. And the solvent for shellac is denatured alcohol, half denatured alcohol. And what you end up with instead is a much more watery, thin, and light finish that goes on easy and lays down nice and smooth. There are several ways that you can apply shellac. Is to use a cloth applicator. It's pretty simple to make because it's just a piece of cheesecloth that I have wrapped up in a cotton cloth and then tied off with a string. Now for the cotton cloth, you can use an old dish rag or a dish towel or an old t-shirt. To use the applicator, you'll take it and dip it into the shellac to allow it to absorb it. But you don't want it like dripping wet, so I'll tap off any excess. Then, because there's alcohol in here, and that's what makes the shellac dry quickly, you want to apply the shellac in bold, confident strokes moving across your project. What you don't want to do is go back over where you've already applied it, because that can start to smear and cause the shellac to streak. Now the pad, applying shellac in thin coats means that in 5 to 10 minutes, the surface is dry and ready for a second coat. But before starting to apply, what you want to do is knock down any raised fibers. As the shellac hardens, any raised fibers of wood are going to get locked in place. So what I like to do is take some 320 to 600 grit sandpaper, cut it into a square, and then fold it into thirds. And then I'll lightly finish on them. Something like shellac offers a really good feel to the project. However, if you like the look of shellac but want a little bit more protection, what I suggest doing is applying 2 to 3 coats of shellac, and then once those are dry, apply a couple of coats of polyurethane to the more vulnerable surfaces. Bag paper and give the project a final rub down. And that'll give you a nice even surface. Now the shellac that I like to use,
what's in them. So I like to reach for 2 different products usually. The first is a paste wax. This is usually a carnauba wax that's been dissolved into a solvent. And they work great for most applications, but it's not my favorite, however. My favorite happens to be a beeswax mixture. Now, during the season, we have shown this wax and them together make a really nice finish for kitchen items, and it makes a great top coat that you can reapply over time to your projects. Nibs that are left off that mixture down into any of the open grain of the project. Once I let that dry for a little bit, I'll come back with a clean cloth, and then I'll really buff it out. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a nice warm glow to the project, and it's going to feel nice and silky smooth.
Find a group of articles at our website, woodsmithshop.com. There you'll also find other woodworking videos, time-saving tips, and great project ideas to get you started on your next project. Thanks for watching The Woodsmith Shop.